if at any point you're feeling a bit faint or weak, just let me know, and I'll gladly take over.
Okay, if I confess I've got COVID, and I think I thought I would be a lot better than I feel this morning, but I'm going to do my best. Did we complete the apologies, David?
We did with Simon, Phil G, and Paula Evans.
Brilliant, lovely. Thank you, everyone. And of course, I've welcomed Fiona, who's joined us instead of Sharon this morning. If I can say about declarations of interest, if they come up during the meeting, if you can let me know, and we'll make a decision on what the way forward is, if that's acceptable to everyone. Okay, thank you. Nice nods and smiles there, which is always good. So matters arising, Sean, we've got one item on the matters arising, which I think is still in hand. I don't know whether you've got an update for me there.
Yeah, I can give a quick update. So this is still very much a work in progress. I've made a couple of links. So through Kerry Wheeler, who is the Assistant Director of Digital Primary Care at NHS England, we've had a couple of meetings with NHS England business intelligence colleagues to see what work they're doing around primary care dashboards, particularly around access. Now, what we're finding through that route is that the NHS England approach at the moment is simply to collate all of the different bits of primary care data that are available in different places on the net at the moment, and they're trying to put them all together in one place, in one portal, which is helpful. But it still means that the data is exactly the same as it currently is. So the data that's being extracted around appointments is only that data which is available from the practice appointment books. And it doesn't give us any kind of further insight into the triage, the online consultations, and the type of clinician that's actually providing the appointment. So that we've drawn a bit of a blank on that, but we've kind of pushed back to NHS England to explain why we need that operational data. So hopefully they're thinking about that in the background. But in parallel to that, I've also been in conversation with Nex, with George from our BI team. And Nex are developing a dashboard, and they're using a bit more kind of sophisticated analysis to try and map the appointments through to the clinician type. Now, we've seen a mock-up of that dashboard. I believe it's free of charge, which is welcome from Nex. These things usually cost a bit more money. So I think what I'll try and do is I will try and catch up with George and Nex and see if I can bring a mock-up of that dashboard to the next meeting. It gives us a bit more insight into the type of clinician that's providing the different types of appointment. There are still some gaps in terms of, I think, completeness of the data, just because of the way that general practice works and how the appointment books work and how triage is now being carried out, which we'll probably discuss later on in the meeting. But it does feel as though that gives us a bit more insight into the reality of the data and the capacity within the practices. So if it's okay with the committee, I'll try and bring an update to the next meeting and show you a mock-up of that dashboard, if that's helpful.
Yeah, we're getting nods of approval. Yeah, that sounds really positive from my respect. And yeah, a brilliant piece of work. It'd be lovely that if George could provide us with some slides, and I don't know whether he'd even want to present to us. It's always nice to meet other colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, if I can get George to come along and talk through some of the data, I think it would be a good conversation. So if I can get anything in the meantime before the next meeting, Julie, I'm happy to circulate it to the committee so you can have sight of that information in advance. Then maybe we can talk through it and discuss it at the next committee.
I think that would be really helpful. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for that. We should have Simon here at this point. Unfortunately, he's got pulled away to another meeting. I asked David if there was anything that he wanted to pull out at this point in the meeting with his chair of finance hat on. So if I just see what David has to say to us for the minute.
Well, I mean, briefly, there's little to report except that, excuse me, we're as close to target as we possibly could be. I mean, that obviously does include some underlying, deficit, but that's throughout the entire footprint of Humber and York as well. There's nothing specific that we need to be concerned about. We had a very full run around in finance and performance to look at all the parameters, and I think what we did in finance and performance was express our thanks, particularly to the finance team, but also to every member of the CCG for managing to maintain business as usual and to keep very good control and assurance on all the parameters. So there's nothing specific, Julie, that I would want to point out except to give assurance that the position is as reported, and that's confirmed by a suite of audit reports that have given substantial and assured assurance. So it's as good as it gets in the situation that we've got. The future financial planning is very unclear, and Simon and his team have had some very difficult and imprecise instructions to follow, but it's as good as it gets at the moment, and so we could, I think, report assurance.
Thank you, David. Yeah, and I'm being a member of both of those committees, I would absolutely agree and share my thanks to all of the teams that are working so hard against all the odds. If I just reassure the members of the public that are listening at the moment, we will be discussing Simon's paper in our part 2 meeting, which is not in public meeting. And what we will do is then ensure that the discussions around that part of the paper will be included on the website in the part 1 meeting. So I hope that makes sense. If anybody has any queries or questions, please just get in touch with us and we'll ensure that we've clarified any issues there that you'd like to ask us. Okay then, thank you very much. And then moving on, and I'm really pleased to see this paper, and I think I really loved reading this paper because it was very person-centered, and it felt very much like a co-produced piece of work, very much that our team are part of the wider team in the PCN. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and I don't know who's speaking first, whether it's Gary or Fiona, but if I'd like to invite you to take it away and talk us through.
So yeah, I think it's me with the. Is this me with the Winter Access Fund?
Yes, please.
Is it possible to show the slides, or do I need to share them?
I wonder if you can share them, unless...
I think I can do it, which
is Steph do it.
Always worrying. Start and I'll catch up.
Yeah, Steph knows I always look for her.
I do struggle sharing on Zoom for some reason. I think while Steph's pulling these up together, one of the things that we wanted to do was to reflect how the Winter Access Fund had been received by the localities in their own words. So in January, we gave a quite detailed view. I think that's the last one, Steph, that's January's.
Then maybe I can't share. I'll keep looking, but I think that's what I had in the pack.
As I say, in January, we gave a quite detailed kind of overview about how the CCG and the PCNs had worked together to get the Winter Access Fund up and running. And today, the report is really to give a more reflective view from the localities, so the CDs, the GPs, the managing partners, across the 4 localities that we supported for Winter Access Fund. or to put it another way, WAF in their own words, if you like. And we've kind of put the report into 3 sections, which is what went well, what could have gone better, and some of the challenges ahead. And then we put a very short summary at the end. In terms of what went well, there we are. In terms of what went well, which I think is, there we go. There was a lot of feedback about the funding, which at a little over £1 million across the whole of the Vale of York was substantial, and it was welcomed. And there's no two ways around that. I think most of the localities all said something very similar, which was, notwithstanding the difficulty in mobilising workforce, a lot of the localities said it would have just been difficult to imagine how they would have got through winter without the winter access. So I think there's a vote of thanks, David, to NHS England, for making it available. I think in terms of process, we did work hard as a whole team to make the process, all the way from the politics that were involved in the very early paper that was put out on this, through to assurance, as straightforward as possible. And on the whole, this has been acknowledged and appreciated by the Pcns. And a common theme that comes through in all the feedback is that as a CCG, we didn't employ a top-down approach. And as a consequence, it fostered a really high level of collaboration between the CCG and the Pcns. And I think as we look towards autumn 22, towards the 22-23 winter, one of the overwhelming themes that come through is to build on that experience, to build on that collaboration as we start to plan for next winter. And one of the things I didn't really expect to come through was the thinking differently bit here. There was something about the size of the funding, the short run-up to being able to mobilise that funding, and the lack of workforce that really forced localities to think differently. This wasn't just kind of business as usual plus. And it really did help PCNs think about how they could look at some of the services that have been impacted by COVID, some of the backlogs. I think from Selby, they said it helped them to support the UTC to assist the increase in same-day demand across that patch. A lot of the localities worked through to bring some of their additional roles forward and recruit them earlier than they would have done in April. So they were bringing them in, planning to bring them in. So the planning was in December, and they managed to bring them in before April. And some of the feedback from the more rural areas is that it really helped them cope, where there is less access for their patients to emergency services and urgent care centres. So it built more same-day primary care capacity in rural areas, which again was really appreciated. I think just moving on to the next slide, Steph. One of the things, one of the resources that was available was a product called Push Doctor, so an online consultation platform. And most of the practices in Central York and some of the practices in Vale have been, it's an awful term, onboarded, but basically they've got Push Doctor embedded in their practice so they can use it. There was mixed feedback about Push Doctor as a product, but there's no doubt about it, having access to that extra workforce that wasn't available locally was an absolute godsend. And for others, it offers them flexibility to increase their capacity in the future when they hit times when they don't have capacity in their own workforce. So it's there. I haven't put it in the legacy pieces later on, but thinking about it now, it is a legacy piece of the Winter Access Fund. And I think probably one of the most significant developments was how practices and PCNs work together to support practices that were in crisis. So there's a system called Opal, which practices can report how much pressure they're under or whether their workforce is under pressure. And in response to that, we'd also commissioned a piece of work at York Urgent Treatment Centre, which had a little bit of capacity in it. And what we managed to do between the Winter Access Fund and that extra bit of capacity is that when practices hit crisis, and there's a slide later on that kind of shows that, we were able to, through the Winter Access Fund and the UTC, we were able to mobilise some GP capacity into support practices that were at times in real crisis. And that's a legacy benefit, because actually the practices, certainly in Central, are developing that on as a product in perpetuity. So, and I think there's a bit in the slide that says Opal 2.5 somewhere, and Opal 3 is when a practice is approaching the point where it would say, this doesn't feel safe for patients and staff, and we're about to cross the threshold. And Opal 2.5 is the advance warning to that, which is an interesting concept, because if you've already called Opal 3 or Opal 4, it's almost after the event you've crossed the threshold. To be able to early warn it and pull in that capacity early will stop practices experiencing too much pressure before we can do anything about it. In terms of what could have gone better, I think as I said in what went well, the level of funding was substantial compared to previous winters, and this was really appreciated. What we heard from all areas was that they felt there was too little notice to make best use of the funding. And if we think about that in the terms of the inability to mobilise workforce, there just isn't enough people out there, and some of the difficulties of process, which I'll cover in a minute. The overriding theme it was that it was a really welcome piece of funding, but it needs to come earlier if we're going to plan and make it effective for winter. And I think in terms of process, there is some feedback, and I had some more feedback this morning, that in terms of process, there's a lot of rules and can-dos and can't-dos around this. They were very clear, but they've proved cumbersome for practices and PCNs to navigate. And it's just because it's a bit of an alien system to them. And I think all the PCNs wanted me to kind of make that as a point, so I have. The biggest issue really, certainly thinking about the work that Fiona and I did with the PCNs in November, was just workforce. There wasn't the workforce there. It was difficult to imagine how you could take the existing workforce and stretch it, or find new workforce that wasn't there. And I think that comes into the thinking differently. And there have been some quite some novel approaches to mobilising additionality, which ultimately help keep practices resilient during the winter. And if we just go on to the next slide, the last couple of pieces were, so the community pharmacy scheme, this was really difficult to get going. A great thing, and I'm sure that as we come into the new financial year, PCNs will mobilise this more. But I think a combination of being hit by the booster campaign and then by rising COVID rates, it just seems to have got pushed to the back burner. But it's still there, and it's still there to be developed. And I think just as a summary for next winter, there is something about tidying up the rules and regulations about how the funding is claimed and what it can be used for, and bringing it in early. And you're just going to hear me say that as I go through the next few slides again. In terms of the challenges ahead, I think if I had to describe the three greatest challenges for practices, PCNs, and the patients that they serve, it would be COVID, COVID, and COVID. Rates ebbed away after the New Year surge, and then they rose really rapidly during March. And to put it into context, in terms of Opal reporting, we had 51 Opal 3 and Opal 4 reports throughout the 3 months of December, January, and February. And in March, we had 56 in 1 month. And I think that just gives a real picture of how badly practices, and we know that hospitals and all other services were impacted as well, but March was a really tough month. And there's no doubt about it that the Winter Access Fund and the additionality and the capacity that created kept practices going, really, where some may have just said, well, actually, we can't do today. And if I go on to the next slide, we kind of get a picture of how that's played out in real life. So the numbers are just the COVID rates. We report every Wednesday what the COVID rates are across eight areas across the patch. And the line, obviously, is just the graph of those numbers. There's some boxes on the left-hand side, which is practice days at Opal 3, practice days at Opal 4. And that is just the number of days that practices across the Vale of York report Opal 3 and Opal 4. Opal 3 is borderline safe, and Opal 4 is probably having crossed that threshold. And what we see through December, January, February is that despite the COVID rate rising and falling, that community infection rate, we see sort of 3, 4, 6 reports in any given week, and that's fairly consistent. Then you kind of hit this threshold in mid-February. The first Opal 4 that you see in mid-February was a combination of a GP surgery flooding and another GP surgery, their IT system going down. And then the 2 is kind of as that was resolved. The one Opal 4 that you can see in the second week of March was a COVID outbreak in a practice which almost closed it, and without an intervention on both clinical and non-clinical staff, that practice would have been closed for at least a day or more. What's really significant, I don't know, are you in PowerPoint? If you just click that again, does a circle appear? Or does it move to the next slide? No, it's not doing it. The Opal 3s in the back end of March, where you've got 12 one week, 12 the next week, and then 16, was the threshold that we saw general practice cross, where it went from being able to cope with the pressures of winter to where the community infection rates were hitting staff to such an extent that most practices were reporting on a regular basis that they were really, really struggling to cope. And it is significant. It was unusual to see so many practices across all 4 localities reporting that they were struggling to cope at the same time. That's ebbed away now, but it's still noticeable, and there is a correlation with that rising rate again. Just moving to the second to last slide, please, Steph. So I think in terms of the challenges, the funding, tell us earlier what the funding is going to be, and help reduce the bureaucracy so we can make more use of it and plan earlier. In terms of process, again, reduce the bureaucracy, thinking differently, things like reducing, having fewer restrictions on some of the additional roles so we can bring that extra workforce in would really be appreciated. And there's a comment about social care. If you're involved in any of the hospital discharge meetings, you'll know that getting patients out of hospital is a real problem, and it's a bigger problem than primary care can manage. But they wanted to make a note that if we can address the social care, then you can clear the patients through, and it helps manage urgent and emergency care better. So if I just come to the last slide, which is the summary. I think on the whole, all the feedback that we got from PCNs was that as a CCG and a collective of PCNs, we worked well together this winter. It wasn't perfect, and I don't think anything ever is. But importantly, our localities used, or are forecast to use 100% of all the funding that was available. And I think notably, well over 90%, possibly as much as 94% of the Winter Access Fund went on additional local workforce and GP locums rather than the online platforms that were available. And that may have set York apart from some of the other areas. I'm not entirely sure, but I thought that was noticeable. They really mobilised at ground level, that additionality. And I think we have some notable legacy benefits as well. Our ambulance service paramedics have now got access to GP triage in every practice across the Vale of York, so they can make a decision with a GP about the best place for the patient that they're attending to go. All of our practices have been offered the opportunity to increase their oxygen supply and lifeline kits, because ambulance delays have meant that some patients have had to wait longer in a GP practice for an ambulance to arrive than would normally be the case. So that's about keeping patients safe. Opal 2.5, as I've mentioned, is basically an early warning and peer support system. It's being established across the central practices, and it has supported all the practices across the Vale of York, and it can do in the future. And we've also seen a spirometry and pheno clinic established at Ascombe Bar, which I sincerely hope is a legacy clinic and helps reduce the respiratory backlog in primary care. So I think that the final word was, as the NHS reorganises, PCNs are just encouraging commissioners at all levels to plan earlier for next winter and continue engaging with primary care in the way that we have this winter, to build on the collaboration and lessons learned. And I think that's it. Thank you for listening to me drone on. Any comments or questions from the committee?
Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe if I just can be slightly less politically sensitive than Gary. I think that we need to remember when this first came out, the Winter Access funding letter was actually pretty disheartening for general practice. And I think it's important to make the point that this has only worked because of you, because of the CCG, not because of the funding that came from NHS England. I think working with Gary, Fiona and the team, all of general practice has found that to be extremely productive, but that came from a place where I remember that first meeting, Gary, to you, where there was just silence, wasn't there, when it was announced? And I remember one GP saying, I just don't understand where this has come from and how this is supposed to help. So the fact that 4 months later we're sat here and the majority has been spent to help practices and improve patient safety, I think is a huge testament to the team at the CCG. And I do hope that future funding comes with, yeah, like you say, more notice and fewer strings attached. But who knows if that will happen in reality.
I just, where's, okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just a general comment, really. I was looking at, you know, the early parts of the paper, page 34, where it's talking about what went well and the process, and the CCG worked hard to get funds out. We would encourage CCG and ICS, which is my point really, to continue to engage with primary care in this way, rather than a top-down approach. And I think if we look back over the last 2 years, the thing that's worked has been the work that's been done on the ground by everybody from the very, very basic grade staff right up to our senior leaders who have actually got on with the job. And it hasn't been a top-down. I don't think it's been our leaders at a national level that have led the response over the last 2 years. I think it's been everybody working together. So for me, the message to the ICS is, you know, let's not have a top-down approach. Let's invest in primary care, because my fear would be that providers are going to be in charge over the next phase for the NHS, and primary care is going to have to fight its corner.
Thank you, David, and I'd echo that. And I think, Phil, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Gary. Really great work, guys. Thank you. Really great work. I really like the slide with the Opal 3 and 4 on. Without creating work, it'd be interesting just to see how that maps to pressures at the front door over that period of the hospital. We probably know what it's going to show us, but I think it would be interesting to do that piece of work. Have we shared that anywhere? Have we shared that through the sort of system, bronze, silver? Have we shared it through primary care collaboratives? Has Alex Morton seen it? It's a really good piece of work, and it's probably ahead of many other parts of the region in terms of the way a CCG has interacted with its member practices, tried to offer support, tried to help practices understand how their situation compares to that of others, and how that leads to peer support and building wider system support. I think there's real potential in that analysis. So if we've not used that potential, I think maybe we should proactively give that quite a shove. It's really good work. The only thing it made me think about looking forward, Gary, was the role of primary care collaboratives, which is not quite explored in our looking back, and the sort of request that's been made to be more prepared for whatever funding's coming in. The context changing because of primary care collaboratives. So that's a conversation to start to have and to start to think about, because we could easily be caught on the back foot just because of the change to the infrastructure, rather than the change of intent that we would all hold. So we should probably just give that a bit of thought and try and shape that as well on the back of the good work that we've already done, shape it on a wider ICS, maybe even regional basis. I think we're well placed to try and do that. But great work, thank you. I can see Steph's going to come in as well, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Did you want to come back in, Gary, before I made my comment?
I was just going to respond to Phil, really. I think in terms of sharing across the system, I'm going to hold my hand up and say I haven't. The analysis was really done for this report, and we were kind of consciously aware of it, but we hadn't done that mapping. So the fact that we have now, it's there to share. Phil, I'm quite happy to work with you on that. The one place we have shared it, there is a Humber and North Yorkshire group across the 6 CCGs looking at OPAL reporting. OPAL reporting, like general practice, is pretty variable across the ICS. And we have had discussions about how we get a greater consistency of OPAL reporting and a greater consistency of response to support practices before they hit crisis rather than after. And I think within that group, we've said this is what OPAL 2.5 can look like. It is replicable and or it is scalable. So there is an ongoing conversation going on really across commissioners. But I think opening it up to the primary care collaboratives and the wider system, Phil, would be really useful. Quite happy to help wherever I can on that.
So I just wanted to remind members that the OPAL reporting process probably commenced in our CCG 4 years ago. And it has taken a lot of developing, trust building. So the fact that it matured into something that has value to the practices that use it, that's the point. It has value to the practices that use it. I just wanted to make that point, that it's taken a lot of effort. It was initially viewed with a bit of suspicion. The processes weren't in place for agile responses to practices. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that why OPAL's worked this year is that maturing at practice and PCN level to offer mutual aid, and mutual aid at a time when everyone is struggling with staff. So sharing staff to address patient safety issues and thinking through what it means after the introduction of technology to support staff working from home as well, to continue to do clinical work, clinical triage. All of those things have come together, and as Gary's indicated, some of the lessons, I don't know if we were the only CCG doing Opal 4 years ago. I think we were. Somebody will tell me if I'm wrong, and that's not a deliberate mechanism to sort of not acknowledge anybody else. But I think we had a tenacity to think that if we stuck with it, it could work. So yeah, I just think it's worthwhile reflecting that a lot of work's gone into Opal over a number of years from the team. So yeah, it wasn't an overnight success. So thank you for everybody sticking with it.
I know there are hands up all over the place, but at the risk of embarrassing Andrew and the LMC, as a CCG, we had tried to put Opal in for about a year and really struggled. There was a sense from practices that it might be used to performance manage them, that there was just a really low trust. There was a high level of suspicion. And we cannot underplay the value of the LMC role in working with us to co-produce an Opal framework and then together take that to practices and get that signed up. That it was a long process, but the LMC were absolutely instrumental in getting the trust building and the acceptance of Opal. And without that, we wouldn't have what we've got now. So I just want to say thank you to the LMC through Andrew for that. It was a really notable piece of work that they supported us with.
Cheers, Gary.
Andrew, would you like to respond to
that? Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I think Opal has been useful for practices, and yeah, it's useful to have a way of indicating that we're not necessarily a limitless resource, and which we're often thought to be, and it's a good way of signalling the need for additional capacity, which has been enabled through the Winter Access Fund, I suppose. If I can just ask my follow-up question as well, if that's okay. So I guess what this has kind of brought out, all this closer working, is the utility of the lead officer roles within the CCG. So I know City of York and Vale and Selby have both found that role to be really useful. And I guess going forward, is there any definitive news or update, if you like, about how that role is going to transfer through to the new system under the ICS on maybe like a longer term basis?
Maybe I'll come in at that point, Julie, if I may. The answer is we don't know, Andrew. The Vale of York, and I can say this because I didn't do it, the Vale of York had the vision to significantly invest in those roles to support practices, and I think that the legacy of that plays through in this winter. But it isn't clear if that could be replicated across the other places outside of our south and north locality, which become North Yorkshire Place and central. We continue to champion the roles, and we would continue to do that because I think the evidence speaks for itself. But no wider or further than that.
Okay, it'd be good. I think it'd be good to have like a regular update maybe on that going forward.
Right, Fiona, you've had your hand up a while. Did you want to?
Thank you. I was just going to pick up Phil's point actually about the role of the primary care collaboratives as they start to evolve in the new system, and completely agree that how we work with them and help influence what we start doing at scale is going to be really important. But just wanted to emphasise not losing that neighbourhood point, which I guess is a little bit of what Andrew touched on around the sort of lead officer roles and the primary care team roles. Having that local focus about what made the biggest difference for our neighbourhoods has just been absolutely critical. So it'd be really key for us all, I think, how we work with the collaboratives to really get the best support that we can on an at-scale level, but just making sure we don't lose that neighbourhood responsiveness, because certainly for the rural localities, being able to flex and tailor their approach to winter resilience in a way that made the most sense for them, their geography and their populations has just been the biggest bit of feedback that Gary and I have had back, I think, around that high trust relationship I think we've got now across primary care and the CCG, not just with the primary care team, but with our finance colleagues and others. And I think those really strong relationships that we've spent a lot of time and years building together across the system with our primary care colleagues and with LMC, I think has just really meant we've optimised things that, you know, not perfect, but I think the winter response this year has been, you know, really different and much more localised than it ever has been before. And that's really added so much value. So I just think it's a nice thing to reflect on how far the CCG's come in terms of the way it works with primary care colleagues. And I think that goes across the CCG. It's not just this team. So how we maintain that and keep that local response is going to be really key.
Thank you, Fiona, and I'd agree about maintaining it for the future. It's no mean feat, is it, developing relationships like that? Sean, I think your hand was up, but you disappeared off my screen for a minute. Oh, there you are. Sorry.
Just to pick up on Phil's point about sharing this more widely, just to remind Gary that we've agreed to share this open work through a WAF showcase process, which is being organised by Helen Phillips at NHS England across Humber Coast and Vale. So we will be kind of really showcasing this work with our HCV peers, and I think this is really one of the more successful programmes that we've done across the region through the winter access funding. So it'll be interesting to share with HCV, and I think NHS England will probably share this on a regional basis as well. So I think we have got that opportunity to promote this work much more widely.
Thank you, Sean. That's excellent news. I must admit, it seems like a brilliant next step. Fiona, I'm sure your hand was up. Yes, it is.
Yeah, thanks Gary. That really interesting presentation, and you know, agree that there's a lot of really positive stuff in there, and just, you know, recognizing what a really challenging situation it's been for colleagues in primary care. I guess just on the last point about you know, that neighborhood level work, and some of you will know where I'm coming from with this comment, but we often, in a local authority with our kind of elected members and ward councillors, we pick up you know, sometimes the negative, you know, sometimes changes affect people in different ways, and so our ward councillors are that kind of point of contact where when people aren't happy, they will often go to their ward councillor to express that. So it's just you know, obviously learning will come out of this. There may be new ways of working that actually practices want to continue with, because, you know, they've worked quite well. And it's just a plea really, and a question of how will we involve that kind of local councillor representation within that, because they are sometimes the voice of a community. And I think if they're quite engaged in terms of, and they know what's happening in the hospital, but probably less aware on individual practices, probably wouldn't be aware of some of this work that's kind of been going on in the background. And I just feel like if they're a bit more engaged in that and understand some of the challenges and the reasons why things have happened in the way that they have, it maybe takes a little bit of that heat out of the system, and you kind of get them on board to be more of that champion for some of the work that's going on at a practice level. And so it's just something to kind of think about going forward, really.
think you're right, Fiona. I think notably, it's in the presentation, but I didn't pick it out in the commentary, is that the latest survey of public satisfaction with the NHS is probably at a 25-year low. It's all about access to GP. It's all about access to hospital. Within health, we understand why that is. And I think the broader public possibly think that, now that COVID's gone and all the messaging around living with COVID, that everything's going to return back to normal without a real consideration about the 2-year backlog of everything routine that it's created. So I think we're very consciously aware of that as a backdrop. We do meet regularly with Health Watch. We've discussed the GP Access survey with them when that came out earlier in the year, and they produced the work, but we co-produced the response. So that feeds its way back to local councillors. Within Central York, we've got the York Health and Care Collaborative, which also feeds back to Health and Wellbeing Board. So there are avenues back to informing councillors. But it's a really astute point, because it's easy to hear when things aren't right, and sometimes it's not easy to make them better. So I think improving the dialogue with local councillors would be really, really important. We've tried hard, given the barriers that have been created during COVID, but we could probably do more. And I think maybe as we see place emerge, there's a good opportunity to do that, because within York as a city, I know we're talking about York local authority footprint here, Fiona, but within York City, having that kind of artificial boundary around it in a different way might encourage that dialogue even more.
Julie, you're on mute.
Probably wise. I was asking the favour of Fiona. Is there any way that maybe we could do that piece of work sooner rather than later? So begin those first steps about linking with local councillors, and I'm sure that if Gary and Fiona were to share the presentation, it would give a little bit of an insight for local councillors into actually what is happening in general practice. And I think their honesty in the relationships with our primary care colleagues can add a richness to their conversations with our community. I think it'd be invaluable, even if it was a Teams briefing or something like that.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up with you, Gary, because I think, like you say, there are sort of high level pieces of work that go to places like Health and Wellbeing Board, but you get that won't necessarily filter down to the ward councillor. So yeah, I'll pick that up with you outside, Gary, and look at how might do something that gets that broader audience.
Thank you, Fiona. It's a win-win situation, I think, on both sides. Are there any more questions or comments for Gary or Fiona? If I can just ask, how are our PCN colleagues? How are they faring at the minute?
I think as the rest of the system, Julie, just everybody's working incredibly hard, but as we know, COVID rates are still really high, so we've got an awful lot of sickness. So people are doing a great job still, as they are in the rest of the system. But yeah, I think it certainly isn't going to get any easier anytime quickly with levels at the rate they are, and we have still got significant sickness. But everybody is working really flexibly, and as Steph alluded to earlier, where possible, doing clinical work from home, triaging and doing a lot more online and things. But yeah, it's still challenging, and I think with the Easter holidays right on our doorstep and several bank holidays as well, I think the next month is going to be quite a challenge, I think, still.
Thank you, Fiona. I think you'll all realise that I just wanted to highlight how hard they are working and to enable those that are listening to our meeting this morning. I was going to say afternoon, this morning, that is actually the case, and the whole of the system is struggling, and it's about working with us, isn't it? So thank you all, a brilliant discussion, and a huge thank you to Fiona and Gary for the work with the PCNs. Thank you as well for the funding that we did receive from NHS England. It was invaluable, and I think we've learned a lot. But we've done that working together, which is absolutely amazing. And hopefully a lot of the things will go forward into place. I can see them sitting really well there. If I look around and there are no more questions, can I hand over to you, Steph, for the COVID update? And I'm sure that Fiona will step in.
Yes, certainly. It's a brief update. So we continue with our vaccination programme at one end of the spectrum. Practices who are signed up as local providers and the Askham Bar site continue to operate at very much reduced levels. There's a spring booster campaign for over 75s, care home residents complete, and anybody with a significant immunity over 12s. So that continues, and vaccine continues to be our number one defence to mitigate the seriousness of the virus. So that's that from a vaccine perspective. Still good coverage across the city, although it is limited. I think that's probably as much as we'd want to say about the vaccine programme. It's still there. There is what we call an evergreen offer. So if you haven't come forward for your first vaccination, it's not too late, it's still available. Likewise, coming up for second or third or a fourth if you are invited to do so. Anything else to add on the vaccine programme, Sean?
Yeah, just briefly, I think we're going into a new phase now where NHS England are trying to work with us to understand how we offer this as more of a business as usual service, rather than, you know, at times through the year putting a huge workload onto general practice and PCNs to deliver this, which is welcome. But I don't think we've quite worked through the practicalities of how we're going to deliver this as a business as usual service with the workforce, the resource that's needed, the estates that's needed to do it. So we'll work through that over the forthcoming year. But for the time being, again, PCNs, all credit to them, have stepped up to the spring booster campaign, and that's starting to go really well. As ever, when we go into a new phase of the vaccination programme, the constraining factor seems to be supply chain, and it still is this time round. So I know over the past couple of weeks, we've been doing a lot of mutual aid around the patch to get limited vaccine supplies into the places that need it most. But yeah, just to say thank you again to the PCNs, the community pharmacies and the vaccination centre for stepping up to this work, and it is going well, but there's still an opportunity to vaccinate approximately 45,000 people across the Vale of York who haven't had a first jab yet.
Thanks, Sean. The other point, so if Fiona comes back, I might ask her to do rates, but I've got the information in front of me. The other point to make about what's happening with the rates and the reinfection rates in the context of what we've been talking about all morning is our workforce is still significantly affected across the whole of the health and social care sector. So, you know, although the media like to talk about mild symptoms, it's still grim. People can't come to work for a couple of days, and that is having an impact across the whole of the sector. So when we move on to other things in the media, that's not to say it's not still there and it's not still having a significant impact on day-to-day activity. As part of that, we've been working with our practices on reintroduction of some services that need enhanced personal protection. So if anybody's listening to this and they go to the practice and see enhanced levels of personal protection as part of the procedure, that's another mechanism to try and help on occasion with infection rates. Gary alluded to it, and Gary and Louisa do some rate tracking for us. So although the case rates are reducing slightly, we're still 10% above the national average for COVID infection rates, with some significant pockets sort of increasing, not decreasing. And I think perhaps it is Gary who alluded to it, 2 years ago, last year, we see a peak every time there's significant holidays, significant mixing with new populations. So I think we're all poised for another spike with the Easter holidays coming up. And within primary care, we've also invested in additional resources to cover the long bank holidays of Easter and the Queen's Jubilee, which will see most surgeries closed, and we're putting some additional resources into our urgent care services just to support that. So that's our update in terms of the virus. It's just continually sustained pressure. There's just no let up. I think in part we're somewhat desensitized to it, but a lot of people are just operating on fumes. I would use that description. Still doing great work, but I think it's easy to not reflect just how exhausted everybody is. Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, thanks to patients for still being very understanding of the need for, using masks and things within surgeries, and conforming to the kind of infection control procedures we've got in place. Because I think it is just worth remembering, as you've said, Steph, that it's rife at the moment. We've got multiple GPs off sick with COVID, too poorly to work from home, and some are working from home. The testing has decreased, so for non-patient facing staff, they're not doing regular lateral flow tests, so there still is that risk to staff. There are some staff who are clinically vulnerable, some staff who are unvaccinated even, and I think it's just really important to remember that while the majority of people have moved on a little bit from COVID, there are still some people for whom this is a real concern and worry. And on the whole, patients have been great, and I'd just like to put the message forward that it is important to, if you're asked to do these things by your practices, that it's for that reason.
Thanks, Julie, that's it.
Have we lost?
Yep, clicked back onto mute.
I think you're still on mute, Julie.
Right, can you hear me? Yes,
There you
thank you. I'm feeling new 101 this morning. I need one of those little books we used to get. Do you remember? Thank you, Andrew. That was an absolutely invaluable comment, and I think sends out a really, really powerful message. Steph, as always, thank you for the update. Always clear, always, you know, that we can understand, but sends out again a message of caution, but also how hard people are still working, and you know, to say people are running on vapor really is quite sad after this huge amount of time. So it is about being kind to everybody and being kind to each other. So can we move on now, please? It's Sean, I believe, for the risk register. Thank you,
Yep.
Sean.
I'll take you through the quick update. So there are no changes to the risks that are still on the register. So if I just start with the serious mental illness health checks, there's no update to the data since we last met. So the Q3 performance was sat at 41.5%, and the national target for this is 60%. We have some pockets of really good practice across the patch. So primary medical, we're at 50%, with people having these health checks who are eligible at the end of Q3. And I know that some of the Vale PCNs have done some really good work. So Tadcaster and Rural Selby were at 55.6% at the end of Q3 against that 60% target. So I think we're all optimistic that we'll hit the 60% target, but we know that 60% is only a number, and all the PCNs, I think, are working really hard just to try and do these health checks for all of the people who are, you know, in that cohort, and who would benefit from this work. So I know that the work is really continuing to try and improve performance and access to these health checks where PCNs can do that. In terms of access, I think, as we've mentioned repeatedly in this meeting, it continues to be a major theme for general practice, and has really been impacted by COVID recently, with people being off sick. Pushing against that, we've had the Winter Access Fund and that additionality that people have talked about. And I think it's fair to say that without the Winter Access funding, we'd have been in a really difficult position with some of these appointment numbers over the winter period. And the Winter Access Fund has definitely provided some additionality in terms of patient access, which was, you know, the objective at the outset, but it's definitely also provided a huge amount of resilience for practices in terms of having something to fall back on when staff have been impacted by COVID and various other issues in terms of staff absences. So I think from the data, and this goes back to sort of my original piece when we were talking about general practice appointments, we can see that for January, which is the latest data, we are above where we were a year ago in January, and the trend in those appointment numbers is generally increasing. It's going in the right direction despite all of the challenges that we've talked about. But again, I always have the caveat around this data that it isn't complete, because it's only pulling data out of practice appointment books, and it doesn't get all of that appointment information that's being provided now through online platforms such as online consultations, video consultations, and a lot of the triage work that practices are doing. So we'll continue to monitor that, and as we said at the start of the meeting, we are trying to get some more robust data about general practice appointments and that whole capacity and demand piece to help them plan with that. And then lastly, the general practice wellbeing risk is still on there. More appropriate than ever, I think, with you know what we've talked about in terms of the real pressures on the workforce. And we know that, you know, as staff go off sick and isolate, that puts even more pressure on the workforce, which is still there kind of picking up the appointments and doing the day job. So I think it's really important to recognise on an ongoing basis that pressure on all general practice staff, clinical and administrative. And we are trying to do what we can to support with some of that. Some of it sits more at a practice level. There are some national initiatives which we're following up as well. And also, you know, the LMC have been really supportive with this, I know, with practices. And at the end of the report, I've just listed some of the initiatives that the LMC have got underway to support colleagues in general practice through a very difficult time. So yeah, that's my report. Thank you.
Go on, Julie, you can do it. Andrew, do you want to come in while Julie's?
Yeah, I think you've gone
In and
back on
out.
mute there, Julie. Sorry. I was just going to ask if there was an update on. A while ago we discussed decompression sessions for GPs. That there was a proposal for funding. I'm not sure. Sorry if I've missed that. But was there an update about that at all?
We haven't had an update for a while, Andrew, but thank you for flagging that back up to us. I know work was being done, and I believe that we did have some takers to actually. Oh, Sean, did you have any answers there for me, or is it another question?
Yeah, Julie, I think we were trying to do something as part of a PLT session potentially. But just to say, we've had some real problems with recent PLT sessions in terms of just securing clinical cover for the afternoon so that practices can take that time out. But we are still working with Vocare and Nimbus Care just to try and secure clinical cover so that practices can have some time out. But the whole system is so impacted by staff absence at the moment, we've found it really difficult, but we'll continue to try. So if we can get that clinical cover that enables practices just to get a bit of time one afternoon, we'll sort that out for them.
Andrew, I think you might also be talking about the one-to-one decompression sessions that were in confidence.
Yeah, so I think
yeah.
I mean, I wasn't sure exactly what the proposal looked like, to be honest, or what was being considered, but I think that there was more than just a PLT session, which I guess I've noted in the paper. You've mentioned some of the potential drawbacks of doing that as a group, and I think that's probably true, really.
Yes.
So I mean, it was just a flag for an update. It's not urgent or anything, but if we could maybe get something at the next meeting.
No, thank you. What I promised to do is to go in and double check how we are with that. I believe we were looking for some funding, but we had somebody who was signed up to do the project, and I'm not quite sure what the feedback was. So I'm not quite sure how long the process has taken. So we did have one volunteer that had gone through it. But I will promise to report back on that, and thank you for bringing it back to us, because it's unbelievably important. Every item today we've talked about the pressure that everyone's under, and it isn't always easy to be among your peers and sharing that you feel that you're feeling less than you should be when your perception is that you should be at this, at a certain level. It's health, mental, physical, emotional affects us all, and I think we need to care for each other. And this was the catalyst for this piece of work. So it's important that we get that sorted. Thank you. Any more questions, Sean? No? Okay, that's lovely. Thank you very much, Sean. Steph, it's back over to you, and it's a reflection on the winter pressures.
Yeah, there's no presentation, and I think everything that we've talked about this morning is about winter pressures and how the primary care bit of the system has responded to that. But there are a couple of themes that I just wanted to quickly touch upon. One is that we talked about the additional money that came in, which was £1 million for the Vale of York practices, which effectively was December through to the end of April. And we always have a long debate about how long winter lasts, and it feels like it gets longer and longer. And we already know the risks around the long bank holidays of Easter. But I just want to put that into perspective, that we had £1 million to support primary care with winter pressures at year 2 of COVID. Pre-COVID, our winter pressures allocation was circa £40,000. So although there's been a commentary back from the Pcns about more forward planning around winter when you get the money, we invariably never know when we're going to get winter pressure monies, and we invariably never know the quantum of that value. So it makes the system, it makes it difficult to respond agile to big sums of money. So I think what we need to do with our PCNs and our lead officers is just be thinking about a menu of options, the things that we thought about that need a bit of a long lead in time. So we've got a menu of options that we can respond to. So that would be the point that I make. Yes, it would be lovely if we had less rules and regulations. However, we are a public body and we are spending taxpayers' money. My team hear me talk about taxpayers' money a lot when I'm asking them to respond to more rules and regulations. And I think the other thing about winter pressures, and I've Fiona Phillips and I have talked previously about the pressure points with ward councillors who are responding and advocating on behalf of citizens, residents, patients when things aren't going well in a local area. We do need to get better at communicating those things, because the backlog and the recovery from 2 years is not that we can catch up in 2 years. You know, I think our acute sector colleagues for some services talk about recovery over 5 years. There is an expectation that primary care can turn on a sixpence and suddenly all the resources there that I've even had it suggested to me, why aren't we working 24/7? I don't know many other services where there is an expectation that would happen when you think about what we do. So there is something about understanding how we get our communication better and more reflective of what our current situations are. And then the other piece that's come through is really two bits of the same thing, fatigue and vacancies. You know, we've got a lot of really valuable staff stepping away from the NHS. They're exhausted. There's not always a lot of love out there. There is in lots of places, but there's not always. And we're carrying significant vacancies in different places. So coupled with our sickness levels, that feeds into that pressure of around backlog and recovery. So the fact that you've heard Sean reporting that our activity, our interaction, our responses are still beyond and above 10, 15, 20% activity levels above what they were pre-COVID, albeit that the balance between face-to-face and non-face-to-face activity has shifted. I do think we should acknowledge the workload that practices are covering. So I think they're the themes that I've heard around the winter pressures that I just wanted to summarise. it's tough out there.
Any questions or comments? Steph, you got it in a nutshell, I think. It's tough out there. I scribbled a few notes there, and it's, I'd say it's a bit overwhelming out there, isn't it? So huge respect to all of our colleagues and all our partners that are keeping on, and just wish everyone well and look after each other. It's back to you, Steph, and this time it's estates update, please.
Yeah, so I periodically we just let the committee know what's going on with our projects around investment in primary care. That it's a piece of work that continues to progress, but they often take a long time to come to fruition. So there are a couple of schemes, 3, that I just wanted to let you know where we are. We've got the Sherburn scheme, Sherburn in Elmet, so one of our south locality practices, and you perhaps heard me talk about Sherburn, Milford, that area that sits at the cusp of Leeds, Wakefield, York, over the last 10 years and projected forward, has a huge amount of housing growth, and that's had an impact on the capacity of those practices to be able to expand to accommodate that residential growth. We've had a number of schemes that we've worked up that haven't been able to be delivered, and the final iteration as a short to medium term response was the Sherburn group practice have gone out to tender to expand their existing property. So we'll generate for 400 square meters more space. So that's quite a significant amount. It's out to tender at the moment, and that the tender packages are back on the 19th of April. It's a significant investment. It's laid out there, and it'll take about a year to develop. We've had capital funding from a whole range of areas, from Selby District Council. They've offered some community investment levy money. There's some residual Section 106 money, and then a significant proportion of money is coming in the form of NHS capital. So the money build up has been quite complex, but it's, I'm sure the practice would disagree with this assessment and say it's double this, but it's taken at least 5 years to deliver this version of this scheme. So I am pleased to see that come to fruition. That's taken a lot of effort, and Dave Eiley, who's in this meeting, has shepherded this scheme and this bid for capital through numerous NHS changes, and it's not without some personal commitment that has been delivered. Likewise, Sean and Michael Ash-McMahon, who've worked on the scheme as well. So that's one of the schemes that actually is about to go on site and delivered. Not in the paper, but just of note, Millfield, who you also supported to expand their practice. They're at the tail end of a 5-room extension on their existing property. As we move into a new regime, we've concluded our estate strategy for primary care, but it is good practice still to continue to do updated physical assessments of the properties. So we've secured some funding for 3 facet surveys, and also Dave and I are working on a piece of work that will fund support for PCNs to do their own estates strategy and service strategy, because actually having a current estates and service strategy will be a prerequisite for future funding that comes from the Treasury. So we'll be in the process of coming out and supporting PCNs to do that. So there's a bit of an update there. And then colleagues will recall that some time ago, 5-6 years ago, the concept of a health and care village was developed at Burnholm. The council progressed with their work, but we're still some way behind with a new development at Burnholm. Again, capital has been an issue for the scheme, and the council have kept the vacant land available, and we're just trying to work through a purchase price of that. Unlike Selby District Council with SIL or Section 106, we haven't been the recipient of any planning gain. So there's in my time at the Vale of York CCG, and sort of since the CCG's existence from 2013, we haven't had any financial contribution into primary care development through that planning route. So we're now looking to work more closely with the council, particularly the planning department, to recognise the residential growth. And you've probably heard me speak in different forums about the York Central development, Huntingdon, Elvington. So it's really important that for primary care, and that's what this committee is focused on, but all of the impact that residential growth and particularly the approval of additional care homes, that impact on our health services, that we engage at the earliest possible moment to make sure that the infrastructure is invested in, to make sure that York is a great place to live and work. So we'll continue to do that. So that's my estates update. Happy to take any questions.
David.
Can I just ask, Steph? You may not know, but you know, there's the survey that's commissioned, which is going to report and so on. There's a lot of estate issues. How is that going to be taken forward into the ICS? Do we know yet what kind of arrangements there will be for estates to ensure continuity?
Yeah, notwithstanding that I am here and that Dave and I offer continuity, we have both Humber Coast and Vale Capital Group that focus on estate. It's traditionally focused on the major schemes with our secondary care colleagues, but actually Dave and I are part of the 6 places for a primary care estates group as well. So each of the places retain their primary care leads, so that there's a coalition of expertise really, and the anticipation with both the primary care estate subgroup, but also the primary care collaborative, is that we start to think more strategically, particularly about estates investment. Because at varying times you hear the pressure that is placed on general practice with the growth of staff, so the additional roles. And when we're seeing a change in the staffing profile of a practice. So a broader range of expertise. I don't want to say we'll see a reduction in GP numbers, although because recruitment is behind target, we are seeing a reduction, but actually we see much more professionals. So even with some agile working and working from home, physical requirements for a growth in a state is still the case. So, I mean, I have a good hold on the Vale of York, and so we are taking sort of opportunistic measures, and we've, over the 5 years that we've been using NHS capital, whilst we haven't seen lots of major new builds, actually we have seen small scale developments that have sort of kept pace, predominantly with the Vale practices. The impact really is in the growth in the city of York, and in fact the residential population growth in the city of York is the highest across the Humber Coast and Vale. So but it would be fair to say that we've traditionally been okay in terms of capacity, and we are now sort of facing a crunch as we get there. So we think that the primary care collaborative will have a key role in holding the ring on estate strategy, and also we're working with the national team who've been developing this PCN toolkit as well. So what I think we're good at, and we are good at points of transition, is collecting information on where we are. What we're not always that good at is translating that into a delivery model. But in terms of, we've now got a database across the Humber Coast and Vale of all the estate strategy and all the premises condition surveys as well. So that is something that is developing, David.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Fiona, over to you, please.
Yeah, just I guess kind of on that translation of the, you know, the data that you've got into the, and then what happens with it. I know that you've had some conversations, Steph, with local authority colleagues who lead on the local plan. It was just a question really from your point of view of, you know, are those relationships working all right? Do you feel that you've got the route in to have those conversations with planners, or is there more that we need to do to try and facilitate some of that to happen?
I think there's always more that we need to do, and I think the bit that we is emerging actually, Fiona, is the role of the public health team in helping articulate the health impact, and I think we could do more.
Okay, so we can try and pick that up. We, you know, obviously our team's been very COVID focused on for the last couple of years, but you know, as we're coming out of that, yeah, picking up some of that broader work and definitely the kind of links into planning is something that we're doing quite a lot on at the moment. So yeah, just want to make it's much easier when developments are being planned to get in those health needs at that stage rather than kind of retrospectively trying to do something. So okay.
Thank you, Fiona. Any more comments, questions? I think for me, one of the important things you said there as well, Steph, is about getting PCNs to have a look at their own properties and giving them the funding to be able to do that. Because I think probably as well, they're so focused on just getting the day job And then we had gifts like the winter access funding, which meant that we had additional roles and perhaps there were no one to put them, so they can start to learn a different way of thinking in regards to the properties that they have, which I think empowers people, and it is a fabulous opportunity, but it's only a little bit of something. We talked about, and forgive me, I've forgotten the name of the surgery that flooded, and I think Sean mentioned it earlier.
It's Tadcaster Medical Practice. Yeah.
I just wondered how colleagues were there and how they were doing, and
so Tadcaster Medical Practice is co-located with Tadcaster Health Centre. So the practice own their own property and York Foundation Trust own the health centre. So they worked really hard to get back into their practice within 48 hours, which was nothing short of phenomenal. And I just think they found it really, really tough. I think previously they flooded, it was a weekend and members of the public came to help them. But that wasn't available to them this time. They got some mutual help from South Milford, thank you, to that practice, so that staff could be based with them. So what we're working with them on now is, again, they got the I can't think of the right name, so apologies if I've not name checked people properly, but the Yorkshire Water Agency or the Environmental Agency came and did a walk round with them a couple of weeks ago, just to see if there are any other things that they could invest some of their insurance money in, or to make the building more resilient. Now, they had floodgates, they're on the flood alert. They've previously put electrics up at 1-2 meters. The building's actually built at a high level as well. So all of the things that we talked about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, about predicting their flooding as a 1 in 100 event, well, they've had 3 in the last 10 years. So we're just working through that now. The practice own the property, and they will now be in another situation where their insurer won't insure them again. So we're just waiting for the outcomes of what the investment needs are and what resilience it will give the practice. But I do think we probably need to come together as a professional community in the next 6 to 12 months on what a long-term solution is. Now we have touched upon that, we've spoken about that. There are some unusual circumstances in Tadcaster, which means that land opportunity is not always available, and we're committed to keeping services as local as possible. So yeah, we're working with the practice to just see what the options are for staying in the property or moving elsewhere.
Well, there's obviously quite a lot of barriers there, isn't there, really? But it is key to have services as local as we can do to the people that need to access them, isn't it? Thank you, Steph, and I hope I didn't put you on the spot, but I was really concerned and I think quite humbled to know that everyone had come together to help them. And it is sad that when it comes to insurance, that the insurance company inevitably walk away. And it's what are we going to do to protect that service then? And that's going to be a really big issue. Right, at this point, I'd like to make a note, I think, on behalf of all of us, really. You will have all noticed this morning that we've got a very vocal member and a very positive member of our team missing this morning, and that's Tim Maycock. And unfortunately, his work role has changed. I think fortunately for him, he's very happy about it, but means that he'll no longer be able to join us at Primary Care Commissioning Committee. I think often when there were silences and I needed an answer about something, I would turn to Tim, and I would get an answer that both inspired and instigated a response from us, which is good, because we're here to hear the sometimes difficult questions and to go on and see what we can resolve. So I'd like to say my huge thanks to him. He's been a wonderful member of our committee, but also brought an element of fun when he occasionally appeared with his fundraising hat on. So huge thank you to him, and a really good morning to the rest of you. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. For those of you that are staying on, I'm not quite sure the timing of the next meeting, because we're waiting for Simon to join us. So if we send a little message out, I'm sure Michelle will aid us on this. And we'll see you in part 2, at which point we will take up, just to reassure everybody, Simon Bell, our Chief Finance Officer, will be there, and we will discuss the paper that we were able to discuss fully today. Okay, thank you everyone, and take care. And the next meeting is June, and we haven't actually confirmed a date, so that will go out on the website, just to reassure everyone.